Okay, guys, I am here to talk to you about assimilation in the Indian boarding schools. A brief history of this topic that I am going to manfully power through, even though I'm at the tail end of a bad cold, maybe even the flu. My voice is not great, but I'm keeping it lubricated with Ricola and some water. So hopefully I can maintain and get the job done. All right. So, anyway, let's start here with the introduction. The Last of the Mohicans is the most famous and most often filmed of James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, a series of novels telling the story of the life of Nathaniel Bumppo, better known as Hawkeye, due to his dead shot eye with a rifle. As a young boy, Hawkeye was adopted by a Mohican warrior, Chingachgook, who raised him alongside his own son, Uncas, as if he were an Indian youth. As a result, Hawkeye has lived more the life of an Indian than a white man since boyhood, and by the age of 18, he's become one of the most respected warriors on the frontier in the colony of 1750s New York. Throughout this book and the others, Cooper uses Hawkeye as a mouthpiece for his argument for the gifts of the Indians and for those of the Europeans as well. In other words, Cooper believes that there are things that made the Native Americans talented and unique, and the same could be said about the English, as well as other European peoples. Okay? His argument was that all the distinct peoples of the world were born with particular innate God-given gifts that gave them particular talents, that they were superior in these particular ways to other people. Okay? Now, however, make no mistake about it, Cooper believed that the white man was superior to the red man or the Indian when the final tally of gifts was told. They had more gifts, in other words, and that ultimately the Indians' story was a tragic one because they were doomed to lose in the struggle of cultures or civilizations. While Cooper's point of view on Native Americans being in any way equal or superior to Europeans was a distinctly minority opinion, his belief that the Indians were doomed was more or less the default position or majority opinion, let's say, of the invaders or the colonizers since the beginning of European colonization. What must be remembered is this. Whether they were English or Dutch, Spanish or Portuguese, they all believed that they were superior to Africans, Asians, Australian Aborigines, or of course Native Americans or Indians, as they would have put it at the time. And while the most charitable amongst them were generally willing to follow Cooper's line of reasoning, they could admit that the native of whichever part of the world did have their natural abilities, which made them in some ways superior to the white man. But as a package, the colonizers also believed, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that they, as the masters of far more advanced technologies and the inheritors of far older and far greater civilizations, were the indigenous population's natural masters, and it was their obligation under God to educate, uplift, and Christianize these inhabitants of the uncivilized regions of the world. Okay? I mean, this was just their duty, their obligation. They had to do this, right? Now, certainly, no one could argue about this. Well, except for the natives, of course, of whatever part of the world you're talking about. Africa, Australia, Asia, the Americas. They tended to argue a bit. And actually, most of them tended to argue an awful lot with a great deal of eloquence, right? And here's where you have the dirty little secret of early American history, which we have absolutely no time to get way into because it's really not the point of this lecture. There were some white folks that argued against the superiority of European civilization, and quite strenuously. And those were people who had effectively become, in one way or another, what I will refer to as white Indians. And by that I mean that they had assimilated in the opposite direction. They were Europeans who had acculturated to Native American society. And what do you know? They had discovered that they actually preferred it to the so-called civilized life that they'd left behind. Okay? They had gone off, lived with Native Americans for some extended period of time, and discovered that they were happier, less stressed out, more satisfied, and they swore up and down that they would not go back to their old life under any circumstances. Now, I can hear some of you thinking, well, how on earth did this come about anyway? Well, in short, they were captives of war, kidnapped by Indians, and then forcibly assimilated over weeks and months into the clan of the people of the given warrior that captured them. Okay? In short, they were turned or transformed into white Indians. Oh, so they were brainwashed, right? Because you said forcibly. No, not brainwashed. By forcibly, I simply mean that they were not given any choice in the matter. Okay? They were taken into the clan of the warrior who captured them, and one day after the next, day after day, week after week, they were just made to become part of the life of that clan. They couldn't escape. They weren't allowed to deny the circumstances that they found themselves in. And slowly but surely, through various methods, they simply began to live the life of these people, okay? And after a period of time, they just became Native Americans. They just were given no choice in the matter. Kind of like the Native American kids in the Indian schools we will be talking about a little bit later. So again, they were assimilated, and once they had become Indians, they liked being Indians better than they liked being English colonists in Virginia or Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York, for example. And in fact, there are a fair number of instances where these individuals, almost always women, like 9 times out of 10 or more than that, 49 times out of 50 women, they were returned to their families in whatever town, colony, that were brought back. Oh my God, Hortense, jolly good. We've missed you so much these 3-4 months, and here comes Hortense. She's like freaked out to be back in like whatever colony town, because you've been living like an Indian for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 14 weeks, 6 months or something, maybe a year. Okay, well, here she is. She's back for like a night, 2 days, 3 days. And then she runs away. They ran away. They almost always ran away back to rejoin their Native American family out in the woods. They didn't want to be white people anymore. They liked being Indians better. Again, they were happier. They were less stressed out. They enjoyed the greater freedom that they experienced on a day-to-day basis, living like Indians. The big difference between Native American assimilation and the American version of assimilation, or the colonial version to begin with of assimilation, is that Native Americans, whether children or adults, did not replicate the pattern described above. They did their best to escape white civilization and were nearly always interested in returning to their people and lives. Okay, living as Christianized Indians held very little attraction or charm for them in the long run. Okay, so white people being assimilated into Indian lives liked being Indians. Almost all of them. Native Americans, being assimilated into white society and civilization, almost every single one of them were like, this sucks. Let me go back to being a Native American. Okay, exact opposite thing. Okay, now here's just a couple of images from the most recent filmed version of The Last of the Mohicans, of Daniel Day-Lewis portraying Hawkeye. You know, kind of cool. You see him here. There's like the shot from the big battle scene in the middle of the movie. And then here he is. You can really see him, you know, like here's like actually from the film. And then here's, you know, a shot from in between where they're shooting scenes. You can see him with this really long rifle, with the temporary tattoos, you know, from the Mohican clan, you know, on his chest, his forearms and everything. You know, the pant legs tied around like this so that he can run faster through the woods and not get caught up by the thorns and brambles and bushes and so on and so forth. And Daniel Day-Lewis with this cool long hair. And this is an amazing film. I really strongly recommend that you see it. It's especially if you like historical epics with a really strong romantic component. There's incredibly romantic film as well. There's a great love interest story in here. Guys, it's good to watch with your girl. Ladies, try to get you to watch it. Just anybody, whatever you are in love with or whoever you are in love with or whatever, check it out with your romantic other, let's say. It's a great movie to watch. So anyway, yeah, Last of the Mohicans. Hawkeye, right here. Okay, now, so let's continue with section 1, which I've entitled Vote Yes for Assimilation, meaning this is the period, not when I would vote yes for assimilation, or I'm suggesting that you would, but this is when there's this very, let's say, positive attitude about assimilating the Native Americans, and there's, let's just say it's a very good-hearted effort. And you can at least, looking back at it, get a little bit behind it, let's say, in terms of what the people were trying to do and why they were trying to do it and so forth. Very well intentioned. Okay, hang on to that. So the early colonial efforts. Okay, this is before we've got the United States of America, during the colonial era, when England is still in charge, right? 13 original colonies. Okay, so from the start, in the British colonies of New England, the deeply religious Puritans had a very specific plan for how to Christianize their Native American neighbors, and this involved the process of assimilation. Okay, now, full stop for a second. The always awesome Oxford English Dictionary, which you will see abbreviated lots of times as the OED, gives us this as a definition for assimilation: the absorption and integration of people, ideas, or culture into a wider society or culture. So the wider society or culture here would be the British Puritan society and culture of New England, right? And they're trying to take this smaller society of the Native American groups, they're trying to assimilate or absorb them into, right, British Puritan society to make them part of what they are, right? So that's what assimilation means, to assimilate. Okay, so Puritan thinking went like this: send some charismatic and devoted ministers out amongst the friendliest of the nearby Indian groups and have them work hard to create conversions amongst the leaders by acculturating themselves to a degree, okay? By learning the native language and even translating the Bible into the indigenous language over time, right? Printing editions of the Bible in the native people's language, so that they could read the Bible in their own language, read it to each other, spread the word of the good book, right? Okay, now once this was successful, as they firmly believed that it would be, since God was on their side, right? I mean, the Puritans firmly believed that God is right behind them because they're so righteous. So once this was successful, have the native leaders, the chiefs in these various tribes, clans, have the native leaders help to create more conversions, right? You get the leaders on your side, and then they say, hey, this Christianity thing is great, and here's why. And they can help to rally more people, more of their people to convert to Christianity. Once a sizable number of Indians had come over to Christianity, have them physically move as a group to a new praying town that had been built for them by committed colonists, and slowly but surely have them start to live more like their British neighbors. In other words, begin to effect the process of assimilation, whereby the Indians would become the same as the colonists, speaking, living, and worshiping as they did. Okay? I mean, this is hardcore, right? The Puritans are committed. Not only are they trying to get the Indians to become Christians, but they're going to build new towns for them, right nearby their town, like a couple, 2-3 miles away. Hey, we're going to give you a brand new place to live, right? So if you just become Christians, and you can come and live in this little smaller version of our town, right? And then we're going to trade, we're going to associate, we're going to hang, we're going to have 4th of July barbecues and, get down together, Christmas celebrations and so on. I mean, they're not just talking the talk here, they're walking the walk. They're really putting themselves out, spending money, spending resources, really extending themselves, in support, let's say, of this mission, okay, of trying to convert the Indians. Now you got like a very groovy painting by Antonio Gisbert, done centuries later in 1883, 250 years or so after these things actually happened, but a painting of the arrival of the Puritans in America, right? Here they are, they've just shown up, they've gotten off the ships. Oh, right, here's John Winthrop, the first governor of the Puritans, raising his hands to God with the Bible, saying, thank you, O Lord, for delivering us unto the new world. And yeah, fired up, deeply religious people here, right? Now, this was the grand vision, okay, of a minister by the name of John Eliot. It was his plan. This is how we can convert the Indians, okay? And here you have an illustration of John Eliot preaching to Native Americans. The artist is unknown, okay, but that's all right. Just good enough to see this kind of image, right, of what it might have looked like. John Eliot out there trying to bring, the Native Americans in this particular group, we don't know who it is, but around to the idea of Christianity. He's got the Bible in his left hand, using the right hand to illustrate his points. Okay, now dig this map over here. Okay, so here we've got the top of Rhode Island. Here you can see Providence, the top of Connecticut, right? And then here's Massachusetts with Boston over here. Actually, here's the coastline. Okay, with Boston Bay or Boston Harbor right here. So here's Boston on all this, and here's Massachusetts, right? Now, praying town, little cross, right? So here's a praying town. Here's a praying town. There's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. You can look at this, man. I mean, they're building them all over the place, right? I mean, they're like Starbucks or something, all across Massachusetts, okay? Praying towns, Indian churches, and training schools, right? Then European towns, rivers. You can look over the map and get a sense of what's going on here. They're committed. Between 1651 and 1676, 14 praying towns were established in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, I mean, think how much money it cost to build all these towns, all the buildings, putting them all together, paying for all this. And I mean, everybody donating their labor, all these men going out there and doing this. And I mean, this is a lot. The Puritans are invested here. I mean, they're like really serving the will of God in terms of trying to make this thing happen. But further growth was stymied by King Philip's War in 1675 and 6. a tremendous conflict with the Indians of New England over that always fundamentally contentious issue, control and ownership of land. The war was enormously costly and destructive. Okay, try to wrap your mind around these numbers. Stop for a moment and think about what I'm saying. 20% of all of the buildings in New England, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, and in Connecticut were destroyed. That's 1,200 buildings. 1,200 structures burned to the ground. Okay? And 5% of all the adult English males were killed in this conflict. Roughly 600 people. Now, you might say, that's nothing compared to World War II or the Civil War. Well, hey, it's a lot, guys, compared to the population of this colonial region. Okay? It's a tremendous number. 600 people dead, 5% of all of the grown men. It's a lot over the course of a year and a half, 2 years. And in addition, a handful of the towns in the interior, okay, out in this part of the colonial region, let's say Springfield is one town in particular, okay, a bunch of towns in the interior that were like much further away from the coast and kind of far from other towns, they were totally deserted by white people. These white people got scared of the Indians, man, and they said, we're getting the hell out of here. We are not going to live out here in the boondocks, in the woods, as far away from other white towns, man, because there's too many scary Indians. And these towns were not repopulated for about 25 years. Okay, it took that long for the Indian fear to die back down. Okay, people were freaked out. So yeah, after the war, the Puritans were not feeling so pro-Indian conversion as they were beforehand, and the praying town efforts and the conversion efforts kind of tapered off, right? People were feeling less like, hey, let's go convert some Indians, and more like, man, these freaking Indians, right? Man, killed my brother-in-law, killed my dad, killed my brother, my Uncle Bob, you know? It's like people had like a bad vibe, right? Maybe not every single person, but way too many of them, okay? So 10 of the original 14 towns were ordered closed up and abandoned by the colonial government. In addition of the praying Indians that remained in their towns, true assimilation was never really accomplished, and the Native Americans who had really converted to Christianity and partially assimilated always remained a semi-distinct kind of twilight population, right? What's twilight? It's not daylight. It's not nighttime, right? It's sort of in the middle. A twilight population existing between the English colonists and between the hardcore traditional Indians who had never made any attempt to assimilate in the first place. Like, kind of sad, strange, okay? Worse, at the outbreak of the war, some of the towns, most notably the original praying town of Natick, were ordered to be emptied, and the populace were sent to Deer Island, a little island in Boston Harbor, until further notice, where they were forbidden to cut down trees, light fires, or hunt game. So it's like they couldn't keep themselves warm, they couldn't cook food, they couldn't hunt animals. So they come and they okay, these are the rules. All right, we're good Christians. We'll obey the rules. And so lots of them died due to starvation and illness. So, sounds like all this Indian conversion and assimilation stuff works out pretty great for the Native Americans, right? Yeah, and in retrospect, it makes so much sense that the Great Seal, over here on the right, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in other words, sort of the motto that the Puritans stood for, was this. Here you have this Indian, right? And he's got an arrow in one hand, and a bow in the other hand, and he's saying, come over here and help us, right? That's what the people of the Massachusetts Bay Colony wanted to think they were all about. And when people saw their seal stamped on things in England or France or whatever, that's what they wanted other people to think they were all about. We went over to America to help these poor Indians, right? But it didn't work out all that well for the Indians. Here's a mural painted in 1937 at the Massachusetts Post Office by the great Hollis Holbrook. John Eliot speaks to the Natick Indians. That minister, John Eliot, yeah, him. He was the one who went to tell the Indians of Natick that they had to go out to Deer Island because of the war, so they wouldn't get hurt, and, people didn't trust them. But wait, we are Christians, and we live in the praying town, and aren't we your Christian brothers who've assimilated? Well, yeah. But, people don't really trust you, and you gotta, and so, you can imagine it must have made John Eliot feel kind of bad, I would imagine, right? He had this big, great plan about converting the Indians, assimilating, turning them into children of God, and, and now he's got to make them go and live on this island under these crappy rules and everything. And so look at this, like their hands tied behind them and chained up and under fear of the gun, little kids, woman, right? And they're being taken out to Deer Island. This Native American man is like raising his hands to God, like, like, oh Lord, why have you forsaken us? What, it's pretty awful. Pretty awful. And it also makes total sense that Americans would keep right on doing this, right? Trying to turn Native Americans into American Americans or mainstream Americans. Or maybe the vision was really just Americans, right? Or does it make sense? Any sense? A lick of sense? At all? Well, let's see if we can sort things out and try to reach a somewhat more conclusive answer to the question with a little more information. In Section 2, the early national period from the time of the War of Independence up into the mid-1860s, covering about 100 years. So, after the time of the colonies and into what we think of as the early national period, okay? The first American approach to the assimilation of the Native Americans, as opposed to the colonial attempts discussed earlier, were formulated during the presidency of George Washington. The colonial patriots had received great assistance from some Indian peoples, while other Indians fought on the side of the British. The Iroquois League, most famously, split over the pressures of the Revolution and disagreements between the 6 tribes about which side to back, with 4 of the tribes fighting for the British and 2 tribes siding with the Americans. Okay, if we look at this map here, right, here's New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island over here. Okay, now here is New York State. Big old New York, right? Here's Jersey, here's Pennsylvania. Right smack dab in the middle and dominating New York State was a territory, the Iroquois Confederacy, or the Iroquois League. Now, it's 6 tribes. This is a map that shows earlier when there was only 5 tribes. But another tribe joined in, and they got some territory right in here, or here it is, the Tuscaroras. Okay? So, 4 of the tribes, excuse me, 4 of the tribes fought for the British against our independence. 2 of the tribes fought on the side of the American patriots, right, and helped us against the British. But regardless, every Native American people represented potential obstacles and certain conflict for land-hungry Americans whose eyes were turned towards the Western territories, out past the mountains, okay? Out on the other side of the Appalachians, there was Ohio and Indiana and Kentucky territory, Tennessee and Alabama. And there was lots of Indians out there, you know? And so we knew that that was going to be problematic, right? So Washington's plans for the rightful treatment of the Indians included fair trade, lawful purchase of some Indian lands, impartial, meaning fair, justice for Native Americans in U.S. courts, and swift punishment for anybody who transgressed against Indian rights. Okay? And here comes the assimilation. Vigorous efforts in civilizing and Christianizing Indian society. If these ends could be met, President Washington argued that soon Native Americans would be accepted by other Americans, right? In other words, again, if we can just make the Indians a lot more like us, then we can all get along, and there's not going to be any problem. That's what Washington hoped. Here's this great famous sculpture that's up on top of a big hill in a park in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which shows Washington and the Seneca, see, Iroquois right here, and the Seneca leader, Goyasuta. Okay, it's like they're face to face, sort of like trying to make sense of each other, right? Coming to terms, head to head, right? Okay, so perhaps needless to say, things didn't work out very well, and relations between the overwhelming majority of Native Americans and white people east of the Mississippi River steadily became more and more problematic, all the way up through 1830. Now, by that time, George Washington had been dead for 35 years, okay, or almost 35 years, when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which forced all of those Indians who lived east of the Mississippi River to remove themselves to an area west of the Mississippi River that had been designated forevermore as Indian territory that would be their lands for them and them alone. Okay, now let's look at the map for a minute. So Washington was saying, well, okay, here's the Appalachian Mountains. And at the end of the War for Independence, white Americans were thinking, oh boy, we're going to get land in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama. There's a lot of Indians out here, and there's going to be problems. And Washington had these ideas about how we could try to get on the square with the Indians, right? To try to avoid problems with the Indians, fights, war with the Indians. But none of that worked out well at all. Because before any of it could be worked out very well, people were crossing the mountains every year by the thousands. Okay, and grabbing land and running into trouble with the Indians faster than you could, like, blink your eyes, okay? So by the time 1830 rolls around, there's been all sorts of conflict and difficulty out here, all kinds, right? So in 1830, Congress passes the Indian Removal Act. And what that law says, if you look at the map here, is that all Indians who live east of the Mississippi River, now here's the river, right? You see Mississippi River right here. All the Indians that lived east of this river, you can see all these teal spots representing ceded lands, lands that were given up. Okay, now more accurately what it should be is lands that were taken by the government. But you can see that the Seminole Indians, Cherokee Indians, Creek Indians, Choctaw Indians, Chickasaw Indians, Ottawa, Miami, some Iroquois, Winnebago, Saucon, Fox, all these different Indians here, okay? They're going to go out west to this area that was designated as Indian territory. It was all this land that seemed worthless. And the Indians were given land out there that, according to the federal government of the United States, it would forevermore be the Indians' land. And we weren't ever going to take it away from them. It would be theirs because it was crappy land. Who's going to ever want it, right? You know, I mean, Well, the Indians are going to get it, because it's crappy, right? Yay! I mean, way before the Indians had to actually, before the deadline came up, some Indians went out there and saw the land and came back and told everybody, it sucks. Don't go. We don't want to go out there. But the ones that stuck around too long got forced to go out there by the army. Okay. They were kicked out, let's say. All right. But okay. So this is what happened. The Indian Removal Act, right, creates a situation where all the Indians east of the river have to go out west, and you get this Indian Territory. Okay. Now, most of this Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma, which you can see represented 5 different times on this slide. Okay. And while there are a great many Native Americans who are now living there right now on tribal lands, the forevermore for Indians only didn't quite work out as planned. Not in Oklahoma and not in all those other lands. See, this is just Oklahoma, guys, right here. Okay. Stick it a little bit out here that you can't see right now. And then way up above Oklahoma. Okay. So that didn't quite work out as planned, or let's just put it this way. When oil was discovered in Oklahoma, it wasn't the best news for the Indians, as it made many white people more greedy for their lands and led to the federal government initiating the Oklahoma land rushes of 1889 and 1893, when a total of more than 150,000 people literally raced at top speed on horseback across the prairie to get a claim on the 6.3 million acres of land that had been made available by the federal government. But on a possibly brighter note, the Cherokee people made more than $8 million from the second land rush by offering for sale land that had been reserved for their further expansion that they'd never used. And so they had clearly learned all the best lessons of capitalism, and thus perhaps the question must be asked, had the Cherokee then become good Americans? I leave that up to you. Okay, but so let's just kind of look at this for a minute here, right? Oklahoma land openings. You can see the lands opened by allotment, by date, lands opened by the land rushes, by lottery. You can see all this playing out. You can make sense of the map by looking at it. Now here you can see some dates. A map of 1884, 1872. You can see how Oklahoma changes. Like, look, there's not that many Indians in this map, and they have a lot more land. And then more Indians arrive. As more Indians arrive, they get crowded in, and other Indians get land taken away from them to make room for more Indians arriving. So they just get jacked and jacked and more jacked and more jacked. And the thing is, Oklahoma becomes the only Indian territory out there. All this other stuff up here gets taken away, until the only thing that's left is this with the panhandle sticking out here and this. That's it. Okay? That's it. Yeah. All right. Now, here is today, Oklahoma, the 21st century state of affairs in terms of the possession of lands. Which tribes have what, and what has been lost to white settlement. Okay? Cherokee, Muskogee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole. Okay? That's Oklahoma now. And if you guys have never seen the absolutely extraordinary television show, which ran for 3 years a few years back, called Reservation Dogs, about a bunch of young Native Americans, Muskogees, growing up on the reservation, or as they put it, on the res, and life on the reservation. And it's just one of the greatest TV shows ever made. It's hilarious. It's heartbreaking. It's brilliant. I can't recommend it enough. You absolutely owe it to yourself to check out Reservation Dogs. Okay. But okay, so let's continue. Now, here are some pictures. Here's a land office in Oklahoma. Back in the day, people like crowded up trying to get their name registered for one of the land rushes. Okay. Another one, just everybody like waiting around, getting ready, camped out, whatever, for the land rush. Here are guys charging off literally as fast as they can go on horseback and covered wagons. Look at this. I mean, it's insane. Giving away free money. But that's the thing. Everybody wanted a piece of that land out there because the piece of land you got might have oil underneath it, and maybe you would strike it rich. That's what that land rush was all about. This is a postcard that you could buy and send to somebody back east, some other part of the country. Hey, look, a color-tinted picture from the Oklahoma land rush. The opening of Oklahoma, 1889. The run. Now, it's very ironic. Dave's father-in-law was in this bunch. Not me. Not your fearless leader. Not Dave Smith. Okay, some other Dave. Had nothing to do with me. Okay, my family's from Missouri, and they were not part of this. Don't be looking at me. But anyway, yeah. So the Oklahoma land rush, if you can dig it. Okay, let me get a little drink of water here. Now, mid-century through 1900. The Office of Indian Affairs had been established by the federal government in 1824 under the authority of the War Department, which speaks volumes, right? Hey, we got to make sure that the Indians are treated okay. Let the Department of War take care of them. You mean the guys that are responsible for killing people and blowing things up? Yeah. Great. Okay. Over the next 40 plus years, under a handful of different commissioners, the Office of Indian Affairs would do relatively little to legitimately help Native Americans. But through the 1850s and 60s, a process set in motion through natural causes finally began to bear some positive fruit. Good-hearted Christians of every denomination, all kinds of Protestants, Catholics, living in close proximity to various Indian communities that had already been beaten down and steamrolled to some degree by the wheels of American progress, these Christians began to work with the Indian communities through the auspices of their churches, allying with liberal-minded middle-class reformers in eastern cities whose Indian populations were like long ago out of sight, out of mind, right? Like their Indians had been either wiped out or diminished to populations of like 20 people 100 years ago, right? And so these people find it really easy to read newspaper articles about what was happening in the West to the Native Americans, and they could get all intellectually and emotionally wrought up over it. You know, you're in Boston like, oh my God, this is terrible. Harold, have you seen what's happening to these poor Indians out in Indiana or Oklahoma or whatever? Yes, my dear, you know, well, we should write them a check, right? Well, you know, they haven't had any Indian problems around Boston in 125 years. So, yeah, you know, it's like, it's easy for them to be all like worked up, you know. 125 years ago, they wouldn't have been all worked up. They would have been saying, these bloody savages, something's got to be done about them, right? But, you know, now, whatever. But at least their heart's in the right place, and they're going to help with their money. Both groups were outraged by the federal government's complete ham-handed ineptitude in handling Indian affairs, right? The Office of Indian Affairs, with any degree of real success. Through the friendship of white allies, the tentative idea of assimilation began to take hold. This being the first step, from the point of view of these religious-minded folks, towards conversion to Christianity. The federal government, encouraged by slow but recognizable progress, you know, amongst these reform-minded folks, began the process of implementing boarding schools for the children of Native Americans, referred to simply as Indian boarding schools, or more generally, they just called them Indian schools. Okay, and these boarding schools would be operated by missionary societies where young Indians would be taught citizenship, how to be good Americans, the English language, and various vocations. Okay, in other words, work skills, occupational skills that could support them in adult life. Okay, now I assume you guys know what you guys understand what a boarding school is, right? Like in Harry Potter, a school where you send your kids off to go live at the school. Now, they're not going to learn how to be wizards and things like that. There's no magic, right? But the kids are going to be separated from their families, okay? And generally not willingly, all right? 99 times out of 100. The parents don't want their kids to be off, separated from them. They're going to be taken from them and put in these Indian schools to be turned into good American citizens, learn English, and to be taught work skills so that when they grew up, they could take their place in the working society of America, right? Okay, now, what's the long-term goal here? The long-term goal is over generations, this would result in the creation of a new kind of Indian who would be assimilated into the mainstream of American society, civilized by American standards, and socially and economically integrated to such a degree that there could be no further possibility of any conflicts between the Indians and all other Americans. That's the premise, okay? Now, here, this image is part of a really famous sculpture up in San Francisco that was executed in 1894 by a very talented chap named Frank Happersberger. It's like 3 parts, a big middle part, and then these 2 smaller parts on the sides, and one of the smaller parts is called Early Days. And in the Early Days portion, you had this Spanish explorer, okay, and then a Spanish priest from one of the California missions, and then this Indian, okay, this sort of like, like subservient, or not subservient, but downtrodden, let's say, posture. And the whole image sort of represents like the way that the Franciscan priests like uplifted the Indians, helped them up off the ground. Well, the bottom line is that may have played really well back in 1894 and for a long time after that. But by the early 21st century, more rigorous historical scholarship had sort of uncovered the reality of what was going on at the Spanish missions, which was that the Indians were tormented and tortured and practically wiped out. I mean, it was just awful. Like, those missions were like vortexes of human horror and misery. And this image is just, it's grotesque. It just makes it seem like there was this loving sort of relation going on. And the priests, in fact, overwhelmingly did not relate to the Indians in that way. They were like the most cruel and difficult, kind of harsh taskmasters. And so in 2018, this piece of the monument, Early Days, was removed and put away somewhere in a warehouse or something like that, removed from public view, because it's just wrong. It's wrong in terms of the idea that it conveys, and it's just not suitable anymore, so thank God for that. So now we enter into section 2, or part 2 of this lecture, which is vote no for assimilation. By any definition, from this point forward, the assimilation vision in the United States is just wrong-headed in every possible way, shape, manner, and form. Because what you have going on at this point is cultural genocide and coercion, okay? Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines cultural genocide like so: the systematic destruction of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make one group of people distinct from another. And that is exactly what was going on at the Indian boarding schools. They were trying to strip every kind of Indianness from these kids, so that by the time they were done at these boarding schools at the age of 18, they'd walk out into the world without any sense that they'd ever been Indians anymore. That they'd walk out thinking, believing in every fiber of their being that they were white people. Okay, the agenda at the Indian boarding schools was assimilation through total immersion. And this was pioneered at Pennsylvania's Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was founded by Richard Henry Pratt, who you see off here at the right side of the screen. You see the school here dead center with these like legions of kids, from the youngest little kids lined up here at the front to the older students going further back and standing at the very back. Richard Henry Pratt had a background which was in the rehabilitation of Indian prisoners in Florida. The process was simple and straightforward, providing Indian children with a basic education and at the same time teach them a vocation so that when they left school at the age of 18, they would have a trade whereby they could earn their living, right? Of course, along the way, these young Native Americans were also required to separate from their families and completely abandon their traditions, languages, and religious beliefs, speak only English, and convert to Christianity. Any resistance to any of this program would be met with punishment, and repeated resistance would be met with harsher and more aggressive punishments, often invoked in the context of beating the devil out of the student, right? So there's a relationship there. Anything Indian, anything from the student's past was related to the devil, Satan, right? The darkness, everything that was not Christian or good or white or light or bright. So this is not good, right? Now, here you have on the upper left a group of children before entering school, Sioux children in 1897. All right. Here is a before and after picture of one student, or it's after and before, actually presented in the opposite direction, let's say. Here's this little child, before going to school, and here's this little child, whatever, 6 months, a year, or something later. Look at the face. It can't be too much later, but there you go. Here is Tom Torlino, a student of the Carlisle Indian School. That's before and after, right? All spruced up and looking like a good young American, right? That's what they want. The experience of being indoctrinated into life in an Indian boarding school was traumatic for young Native Americans. In every sense of the word, their personhood was stripped away and they were turned into someone else, someone who many of them had difficulty recognizing, both externally and internally, forbidden to speak their own language, which had shaped and defined the world, cosmos, and even reality itself in a way that English could not, compelled to cut their hair short in the style of Americans and to wear tight, confining clothing, asked to desert the spiritual world of their ancestors and to accept the God of the Christians. All of this equally profoundly jarring experience. The separation from their families did not help matters, and the fact that many of them suffered physical and even sexual abuse under the care of those running the Indian schools only made matters worse. There are photographs from a couple of the Indian schools. This is an image from the TV show 1923, this episode from about 2 years back. You guys may have heard of the show Yellowstone, which is like the most popular show on television in the last 5 or 6 years. It's sort of interesting. Some people have this idea that it's this sort of, it's about a Montana ranching family, and people often have this sense that it's this sort of pro-conservative, like MAGA America show. But the ironic thing is that it's really not. It's got as many liberal viewpoints as it does conservative viewpoints, as many let's say, white conservative viewpoints as it does viewpoints that come from non-whites. And it's really just a mix and a balance of everything. It's really not what you might think. And it has some spin-off shows that tells the history of the family going all the way back to just after the Civil War, about how the Dutton family got to Montana, founded their ranch, and so on and so forth. And one of those shows is called 1923. And one of the storylines in that show is about this young woman who ends up being sent to an Indian boarding school. And it's really strong and really painful to watch, really compelling. And this young woman, this actress who plays that character, just does an unbelievable job of just just giving the viewer the sense of all of this I just talked about over here, just the mental and emotional trauma of having everything that you are, were, believed, thought, whatever, sort of like ripped out of you, or the attempt as they try to take that out of her, the nuns, Catholic nuns, and this attempt to try to like cram her full of all this white world Catholic, dogma and so on and so forth. It's fantastic stuff, really. Great television viewing if you're down for that kind of thing. But anyway, here are some more images. These are of the Tulalip, Washington Indian School, one of the most famous and most successful, if you will, schools that were ever in business, let's say, doing their thing. Really excellent photos in terms of giving a sense of the size of the school, the number of students. Okay, so here I want to talk about one school in specific, which is the Tucson Indian School. Okay, so Tucson at the very, very bottom of Arizona, just really close to the border with Mexico in the 1880s, flanked on either side, Tucson, the community, is by the O'odham peoples. In the east are the Akimel O'odham, or as the Europeans called them, the Pima, or the river people. And in the west you had the desert people, the Papago O'odham, to the Europeans, or pardon me, the Papago to the Europeans, and in their own tongue, the Tohono O'odham. A need was seen for an Indian school in this region, as both O'odham peoples were perceived to be in need of assimilation. They'd been under the guiding hand of the local Presbyterian churches for quite a few years, and the church leaders agreed to oversee the construction of the school. The federal government financed the construction and placed two missionaries from Philadelphia, Mary Whitaker and Howard Billman, in charge as the head teacher and the superintendent, respectively. Now, if you look at these two maps, the small map, so here you see like a contemporary sort of map, right? California with LA and San Bernardino, San Diego, whatever. Here we have Arizona. Here's Tucson, okay, just north of the Mexican border. Phoenix is up here, right? Okay, now if you sort of focus on this point, okay, where the border shifts, and you come down over here, so here's the point, all right? Tucson is right about here. Okay, so here you have the Papago and the Pima people, or the two O'odham peoples, okay? So this is the area primarily that this Indian school is going to draw from, like most dramatically in terms of the two large populations, right? So close to 60 students were enrolled in the first year, and the curriculum was evenly divided between academic and vocational coursework. After two epidemics, a medical facility was built on site, the labor being provided by the older male students. As the farming operations grew, enrollments grew to 175 students, so basically a few times larger. By 1940, there were 18 different tribes, so no longer just those two tribes, but 16 more tribes represented in the student population. Okay, so here you see the Indian school, some students down here, all right, and then here is an Akimo O'odham chief. I don't have his name, but just to give you a sense of, what one of the chiefs of one of these peoples looked like. All right, now here you have an Okemo O'odham family, photograph taken by Carlos Gentile in 1870, and here's a photograph taken by maybe the greatest of all photographers of Native American peoples, Edward S. Curtis. This is an Okemo O'odham home, all right? So in order to sever their connection to their tribal identity, the children were forced to convert to Presbyterianism, accept Christian names, and cut their hair. this latter issue being of central significance for both the Akimel and the Tohono O'odham peoples, because in their cultures, only men with the longest and most glossy hair were privileged enough to serve as dancers in important tribal ceremonies having to do with spiritual and gender roles. Okay, so spiritual roles, right? Roles having to do with the most, let's say, sacred aspects of their cosmology, okay? And then gender roles, right? Really important positions in terms of how men and women would relate to each other. Okay, that's linked directly to how long's your hair and how awesome is it? How great does it look? Well, that's not going to work anymore because all the men are going to cut their hair off short. So here's like a complete disconnect between the white missionaries, the people who are running the school, and the student body, not to mention their families, okay? The issue of gender roles also came to the fore when it came to working on the school farm. For these young Native Americans, it was unheard of for men to work in agriculture because traditionally in their societies, this was a role that was strictly relegated to the women. Women worked on the farms. Men never worked on the farms. It was a responsibility of the men to hunt for meat. Men went out however many days out of the week and went after whatever it was, rabbits, deer, woodchucks, whatever kind of game. In relation to both these issues, quite a few of the male students rebelled at the individual level. As at all Indian schools, misbehavior was met with harsh reprisals. In early 2023, as part of the U.S. Department of the Interior's Road to Healing Tour, descendants of those who had been sent to the Tucson Indian schools and 46 other Arizona Indian schools, so not just this one, but there was 46 other ones ultimately, okay, a lot of Indian schools in Arizona. So their descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, met at the Gila River Indian community to share stories of what their family members had undergone during their time spent in the schools. Okay, one person told of how her grandmother had her tongue split, cut up the middle, for speaking O'odham, just for speaking her traditional language. Others spoke of whippings, severe slappings, beating with sticks, or being beat with cat o' nine tails, which is a whip with 9 smaller whips on it with beads or spikes on the end, okay? Withholding of food for many days, and incarceration in small dark closets or boxes, sometimes outside overnight. These were punishments that were not out of the norm. Short electrocutions with car batteries were described. Over 3,100 students died in the Indian boarding schools in Arizona. 3,100. But just remember, since all of this was done in the name of God, assimilation, and Americanization, then it must have been the right thing to do, right? And since all Native Americans have happily assimilated into American society, then they must have no more need for reservations and all their problems must be gone, right? Kind of wrong, as it turns out. Even the most cursory research into the realities faced by Native Americans in the early 21st century reveal that no other racial or ethnic group, no other group, not Mexican Americans, not Asian Americans, not African Americans, has so small a slice of the happiness and prosperity pie that we refer to as the American dream. Native Americans have the highest poverty and unemployment rates in the United States. The average unemployment rate is 25%. On the Montana Blackfoot Reservation, it's been as high as 69% at a time when the U.S. average was 6.7%. For Native Americans living in Indian country, meaning out on the reservations, the income level is about 50% of the American average. So like the American average is $40,000. For Native Americans living in Indian country, it's $20,000. In 1989, the median income for Native American households was less than $20,000. For the Tohono O'odham, it was $11,402 at a time when the median national income was over $38,000. In 2009, over 20% of Native American reservation households earned less than $5,000 annually, while only 6% of the overall U.S. population earned an annual income of less than $5,000. The average median income in 2009 was over $50,000. $50,000 compared to $5,000. The average Native American family is larger than the American family on average, yet only 30% of them have health insurance. Infant mortality rates are higher than average, as are adult mortality rates. Suicide rates are higher. Levels of alcoholism and drug abuse are worse amongst Native Americans, and 10% more Native Americans smoke than the national average. So yeah, it's pretty great being an American, huh? Especially when you're a Native American. That's where the bragging rights really come in strong, right? That's a, man, OG Native American, right? Original. Much, much better than being out on the Great Plains, in the sunshine, hunting bison as means of survival. I mean, access to Budweiser, Mickey D's, Ford F-150s, and streaming The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills has really been a step up in the world for the Indians, Native Americans, American Indians. Yeah. Okay, guys. Thanks for being here. I made it.